We will dive in. Um, I think it's helpful to start with just an appreciation for the focus on children and the value of a focus on children, because it's really true that when we lose a focus on children, we lose an appreciation for the gendered reality of marriage. We lose an appreciation for protecting sexuality within marriage. All the things that society really depends upon, really, it seems like, hinge on our focus on children and what children need. And so I'm going to approach those differences from that lens. I love to cite that Carl Zimmerman book, and that I believe UFI probably had a role in helping this get published, but where he, as this very important sociologist across the first half of the 20th century, and one of the founders of sociology at Harvard, along with Sorokin, how he does this review across civilizations. His idea as a sociologist was to look at the place of the family within society. And so he sees this pattern where the rise and fall of civilizations follows the role of the family in society. And so you see the trustee family, that clan family, and then it shifts to domestic family, which what he defines as the domestic family is when there's a balance of power between the society and the family. And the family the clan doesn't really allow the family power, the individual family power. The clan controls everything. The domestic family places some balance there. And then the atomistic family is kind of the end of civilizations, in which the individual is the one given primary responsibility and power, and the family plays no role. And so, of course, you can see where we're going in terms of our own society. But I love how he concludes, as he's looking at the rise and fall of every civilization, major civilization across time, that at the peak of their creativity and progress, it was a society in which the orientation was to the nurturing of children within the family, the bearing of children, the nurturing of children. A society focused on that really engenders the best within that society. So just quickly, I just added some slides. It's when I teach students this topic, inevitably there is a student who comes up to me at BYU and will say something like, my teacher in a particular class told us that all differences are socially constructed, that all differences between men and women are the product of society. And so I'm always struck by that. I think they are misinterpreting something from those professors at some level, but I'll just remind them that biologically, you don't exist as a zygote without being gendered. We don't exist, those 23 chromosomes, of which one is a set of sex chromosomes that determine the expression of that sexuality, and then all of the other chromosomes that from which the body is created. Many, if not all, expressions are shaped by those sex chromosomes. So even the chromosomal pieces that look like they are not gendered, that aren't sex chromosomes, they are influenced in the way they express all the structures of the body by the presence of that XX or XY reality. So that biological reality is literally woven into every cell. I know you know this, but we see that in brain differences, and even those who might see themselves as socially constructed in terms of appreciating the fact that equality has been hindered for women because of social construction. I think they can do that and at the same time appreciate this reality of differences. And I really appreciate people who are wise that way and who will say, we lose our strength when we do not appreciate the distinctions between men and women that are biological. So this is just a quick list, and I'll just run through some of these things with students: the structure of the brain, the way that circulation happens in the brain, the size of different parts of the brain are shaped by that XX or XY chromosomal reality. And the fact that we have different hormones, that we have different biological processes going on, then affects a whole host of other things. And so these are some other kind of biologically shaped differences that are just very consistent. And so I just start by that, appreciating the significant role of the body in these differences. even as we are shaped by society. And that leads to, I think, what I think we're getting a clear sense of, I hope from a religious perspective, as well as a societal perspective, is that human beings are by nature relational. We develop relationally. We thrive out of relationship. The me is entirely the we. The me emerges out of the we. And that helps us understand why the family plays such a role in causing both painful outcomes, in the sense that ruptures, we can talk through what divorce means, what being born out of wedlock means, what all those risks that are associated with this non-core wholeness are so challenging. And it's because we are relational beings. And so our thriving, our flourishing as individuals is totally the byproduct of the relational strength. And I think that we have to think about this more if we want to understand the crisis among adolescents, the crisis in well-being among young adults. It just remarkably difficult time for those populations. And I think as we look more closely at, like, Tyler Vanderwill's recent work, he's the one that does a lot of religion work, the impact of religion. He just came out saying that forever we've had this U-curve relationship where young adults do well across the life course. Young adults have a higher flourishing, and then during midlife that dips, and then older are doing well. So you've had this U-shaped curve in terms of well-being. But in recent years, that left side of the curve for young adults has completely flattened out. And his conclusion was, of course, religion's playing a role. Of course, identity is playing a role. And we know from other data, from Brad Wilcox and others, that this delayed marriage, not entering into those stable, solid relationships, the increase in loneliness, that's skyrocketed. We can just see this is really a crisis of connection. And that, of course, begins with the core relationships of family that you know so well. So that starts from birth. And what you have is, you all know this data, but just the critical role of attachment in development. And this has not decreased over time. This Bowlby's work 75 years ago has only increased as we've been able to actually observe the brain, meaning an appreciation for that. The role of attachment has only increased. So here's some comments from a more recent researcher who's also just remarkable. And he would say, this is his language: Mother Nature and Mother Nurture combine to create this human being. And what that means is the brain comes, all the parts intact when birth happens, but the connections among all of those brain parts are not established, and that process is experience dependent. When I was first studying attachment, our assumptions, we couldn't look at the brain. Our assumptions were, well, that the left brain is what's being developed, because we could see linguistically the importance of that relationship for the capacity for language to develop. But now we know, because we can actually see it now with technology, that it's that right side of the brain that is undergoing incredible, massive development. 1 million synapses a second, they estimate. And that's the interconnection between all of these parts. That process is entirely dependent upon stable relationship. And so this is just giving a sense of that incredible process that's happening, and why he would say brain development is not genetically encoded. It is experience dependent. And we know it's not just the brain. This is regulation that happens across all the physiological processes of that infant's life. And so the very first task of that infant, which we know they are needing to eat and sleep and all of those things, those play a sub-important role to this task of establishing a bond of emotional communication. And so we now can see how that infant emerges searching communicating, interacting. We think they're just sleeping and whatever else, but they are, the eyes, all of this searching for someone with whom they can deeply connect. And we know they are primed to look for mother. They know her smell, they know her tone of voice, they know her movement, they know her touch. Part of the brain is wired to be more, there's a greater space in the brain for a woman's face. So they are made to actually look into a face. And it is quite literally from looking into the face of another and the love of a mother that the sense of identity is formed. That is true across development. We see it right from the beginning. So just that these core relationships are so fundamental to development. And of course, what's remarkable is that mother is also psychobiologically primed to establish that bond. And so in the process of cooing and cuddling and eye gazing and holding and breastfeeding and all of the things that are happening, we can now see how they are co-regulating the central nervous systems of their bodies, mother and baby, calming and soothing. In the process, cortisol is dropping, oxytocin is being activated, and this absolutely incredible process of communication through emotion that is building identity and well-being and emotional sense is happening. So I marvel at this research. And for us to be able to look at the brain and actually see that happening and to even more fully appreciate the significance of this process than we ever have, it's very significant. So face to face, body to body, sound to sound, right brain to right brain, now we can see, which is the emotion center of the brain, the moral center of the brain, the identity and well-being center of the brain. That is what's happening in this process, and she is made to do it. So I love how we can now see the self develops in the context of a relationship with another self. We are relational beings. Development emerges out of relationship. And our flourishing is actually found within relationship. It's not that we develop and then we part from that relationship. We use that relationship as a crutch for our development, and then we flourish as autonomous, self-actualized beings. But human flourishing so clearly is actually deeper within relationship, greater capacity for intimacy, more robust ability to know and be known, to love and be loved. That's what we're trying to experience as human beings. And so this is just, right, some summary of that. Sorry for so much language text on these slides, but just this second paragraph just goes through what that right brain is responsible for: the capacity for attention, regulation of stress, experience and read emotions, self-awareness, social intelligence, empathy, sense of morality. And so it really plays a very critical role in this initial 18 months. I love that now we can see that in that very first period, mother plays a fundamental role, of course, and she is dependent on father who's enabling her to do that work. But by 18 months, and these are rough estimates, but that relationship with father then comes to be very significant. And the way we can now see it is they operate as different systems: mother-infant system, father-infant system. They are distinct systems. And so that influence of father that happens that 18-month toddler period, especially important. He's impacting that left side of the brain, the language side of the brain, that then emerges as critical for development in that stage. So you just see this really remarkable complementarity happening with these two distinct systems that the infant is wired to depend upon, to look to, and both that female and male, that mother and father, are offering what is essential for growth and development. So you probably all know these things, so I'll just go quickly through this. But we know, for example, that oxytocin is experienced by both mother and father. It's much higher in mother, but also with father, especially when he's in the presence of that mother and baby, and decreased testosterone at the same time when he's in the presence of that mother and baby. And so what's interesting is that the oxytocin that they are experiencing seems to turn on different types of attachment behaviors. So in her, it tends to elicit gazing and touching and cooing, eye-to-eye contact, a lot of that, and expressions. And incidentally, I should have described this better, but when she is looking at that baby eye to eye and regulating the emotions in behalf of that baby, that's what's happening. This gaze, this connection is so powerful. And she is hardwired, and that baby is hardwired to experience that together. So that oxytocin is eliciting those kinds of behaviors from her, while it's eliciting different behaviors in the father. And for fathers, that oxytocin tends to induce more stimulatory kinds of behaviors, like reorienting the body, right? That tossing, the tickling, movement, what we would describe as stimulatory inducing. So not core, but an openness to other things. And you can see it in other ways as well. Like they'll describe how a mother would take a ball as this child is growing and describe it and use a lot of language and talk about what the ball does. And the dad would take the ball and bop the baby on the head with it and just approach that relationship in a different way that is using things in unique ways. So when I summarize this, and I know I do not, these are rough ways of describing this, but all my searching, it looks to me like what's happening is that mother is really building identity, emotional understanding, moral development, and father is building capacity for relationship with the outside world, understanding boundaries, understanding achievement, understanding how to work within systems. Also empathy. When you look at that Harvard Grant study, when it found that closeness, the 75-year study, closeness in child to mother actually predicted the amount of money these men earned across their life, and closeness to father predicted the quality of their relationships in adulthood. So the quality of their marriages and their extramarital, outside of marriage relationships. And so it seems like, just like fathers holding a baby, they tend to hold a father, more likely to hold a baby like a football, looking at the outside world, then they're giving that child a view of what they are seeing. And it's indicative of how they tend to be impacting the development of that child when we look at just on average predictors of closeness to father and outcomes. So there's interesting things in terms of behaviors that are also different that would shape how a child, why a father is so impactful in their relationship with the outside world and understanding boundaries. And one is that fathers tend to, on average, intervene less frequently in terms of disciplining than mothers do. Mothers tend to intervene and correct and guide and a lot more frequently. Fathers do it less, but when they do, they intervene with more holding that boundary, more consistency, more firmness, more predictability. And it's interesting, but just the male presence, and I know you know this, but it's been hard to say it, I think, because of concern about what this means about men and women and equality. But men really do, by their very physical presence, tone of voice, body shape, muscular build, all of those things that are distinctly biological for them, they seem to carry a sense of authority, a presence of authority that child perceives. And so mothers intervene less often or more often, but they are flexible and they reason through consequences. Dads do it less, but they give this sense of the boundary will hold. And of course, both are important. Both shape development in really important ways. I know you're familiar with this data on fathers and play. Tim Rarick, I love to hear him talk about this, but just it's really interesting to think about this unique way that fathers tend to engage in play with a child, and what we've just said about fathers impacting their development and their way to relate to the outside world. So play is predictive of, right? Park found that boys whose dads played with them more were more popular in school. And so he's theorizing about what's going on, and that it seems to help that child learn how to regulate emotions in helpful ways and handle themselves and that impacts their ability to relate to others. So here's Park's conclusion that this play facilitates less aggressiveness, more pure competence, and it's a predictor of relational capacity. So I think it's Brad Wilcox who wrote this piece for Health and Human Services, just summarizing. It's still on the Health and Human Services site. It's a great summary of data on fathers, but this was his conclusion. Rough housing with dad appears to teach children how to deal with their impulses and to experience physical contact without losing control of their emotions. So once again, it's that sense of boundary. It's handling oneself in relationship to other people, while mother is building the capacity to have emotions, to feel, to experience. So this just is an interesting, I like this Ross Park and Palkovitz and Packett, all three of those are fatherhood scholars of the highest, I have the highest respect for. And it's interesting how they're talking about complementarity. So father's physical play is characterized by arousal, excitement, unpredictability, while mother's is more modulated, less arousing, and more conventional, the way she holds a ball and talks about that kind of thing. So these both are really important. You see Palkovitz say fathers have a destabilizing orientation, and it corresponds with typical approaches in other interactions by exciting, surprising, destabilizing them, stimulating their openness to the world. So there again, it's this way of relating to the outside world. And she has built core capacity to even be in the world, and he's affecting how you experience that world. So Packett calls it an activation relationship, that a father's relationship is an activation kind of relationship. This shows up in terms of learning, like mother's building, it's her language, it's her way of communicating that's so important, that emotionally sensitive, verbal, cognitive, stimulating, to build academic capacity. But then it's very interesting how we can say now or see that when a child comes to kindergarten, they've needed exposure to books and language, that really shapes whether or not they're prepared for further learning. And that's not something teachers can easily make up for. They already show up in a very different place, as you know, by age 5. But what is fascinating is it appears she's building this capacity for learning and language understanding and all of that's foundational for mental capacity. But he is shaping social emotional readiness to even handle a learning environment, to handle that experience of taking in knowledge. And then I love how I forever was like, oh, it's moms, right? It's word count for mothers. It's so important for academic capacity and linguistic capacity. And she's playing such an important role in that. But now we can see that fathers actually are a predictor of vocabulary development. And it's because mothers tend to adapt the language they use very intuitively, aware of what the level of that child is. And fathers don't adapt. They just use big words. And so it's his variety of language that then is predicting vocabulary development in that child. And you can see how both are absolutely critical, meaning her meeting them where they are and helping them learn from where they are, and his kind of not caring about that and throwing in words they won't understand plays a role in that academic capacity, that mind capacity. And then, of course, this is painful data and also very significant, but just with this whole reality where boys are languishing, where you have not achieving academically relative to women, not getting employed, this whole growing group of working age men who are not seeking employment. And of course, that's tied to marriage. Marriage is such an important structure for men to encourage development that way. But given that, then you have children growing up without fathers. And of course, that is shaping this academic achievement, where we can see that the most important predictor of graduation from college is an involved dad. So Brad Wilcox, who was the one to first publish this data, his comments are, based on all the stuff we've talked about, fathers seem to provide a very special mix of engagement, of affection, of supervision, of expectation. Fathers tend to be the ones to require children to exhibit knowledge. Mothers will tend to move in and help them. If you had a child and a mother and a father behind there, this child's taking a test, a placement test or something, mother would be more likely to step in and say, remember how to do this, and dad to pull back and say, you got it, you know what to do. And I love how Andrea Doucet, when she went to study stay-at-home fathers in Canada, she wrote a book about it. And and it's fascinating because when she first started going in and watching these stay-at-home dads, you've probably heard this, but she noticed that, for example, it would be lunchtime and the dad would say to the child, go make your own lunch. Where she'd see a mother who'd be like, what kind of sandwich do you want? Should I make you cheese or peanut butter? She'd see the dad say, put your own backpack on and tie your own shoe and those kind of things. And at first, her judgment was disengaged men. Women are always carrying the brunt of things, right? That was her lens. And then she just really wisely, as she's looking at these patterns, she says that, of course, children need from that nurturing, both holding close and letting go, being prepared to let go. And so she concludes fathers seem particularly adept at being able to facilitate children being able to move forward in the world. So you see Ross Parks saying they stimulate openness to the world, an eagerness to explore and discover. Packett saying fathers tend to encourage risk-taking, even as they're ensuring safety and security. Doucet saying fathers tend to foster independence and the capacity to solve problems. Palkovitz saying fathers tend to be more cognitively demanding or skill demonstration demanding. They push children more to demonstrate knowledge so they can function well in the outside world. So here's that same thing, this complementarity. Fathers focus on helping children learn to do things independently and find solutions to their problems. And as Andrea Doucet says, it's this letting go that fathers are particularly adept at. Palkovitz, and just quoting again, that tend to be more cognitively demanding, while mothers tend to give more scaffolding. And both are really important. Mothers tend to intervene, fathers tend to hold back. Fathers push achievement while mothers stress nurturing. That's from that 2006 Health and Human Services report too. It's just really fascinating to look at this complementarity. So that's why they conclude children who grow up with involved fathers are more comfortable exploring the world around them and more likely in that engagement with the world to exhibit self-control and pro-social behaviors. That's just amazing to me. So it's also fascinating. Palkovitz writes in this book, this edited volume, about the power of difference, just having difference. And of course, mothers look different, sound different, talk different, biologically, physiologically. Fathers do the same thing. They're different. And so he just concludes those differences can be very stimulating to children. Even those that appear quite superficial, whatever, body kinds of differences. And even if the father and mother behave in generally similar ways, even if you had a mother with more masculine energy, so to speak, and a father with more feminine energy, their presence presents contrasting images and experiences. A father who's usually larger has a deeper voice, wears different clothes, moves and reacts differently, communicates in a different verbal style to children, all of which are distinct from the mother. The infant learns that mothers and fathers can be expected from beginning. That infant learns they will fulfill different needs for me. When they're hungry or tired, preferring mother. When they want more active play, preferring father. So he just concludes, there's considerable evidence that the family structure that is most favorable to the socioaffective development of young children is one in which parents reflect the different styles, voices, histories, and connections of distinct maternal and paternal patterns. Children benefit from discrimination learning in the positive sense, in the formation of and analyses of differences as they experience the psychological and physical differences between their parents. So it's just, and he ties that to more advanced cognitive functioning as well as personality and understanding personality differences. There's power in just the difference being there. And of course, as you know, that means, as Margaret Mead really strongly concluded from her anthropological work, just saying one of the most important learnings for every human child is how to be a full member of its own sex and at the same time relate to the opposite sex. And her conclusion was this requires the continuing presence of a mother and a father, because both the same sex as me parent and the opposite sex from me parent become important in understanding self. Now, when I think it's just powerful, this, oh, I needed to admit, Marcia, I'm sorry, that if we think about the formation of a sense of self requiring that relational connection, that in that baby looking for the eyes of someone else, this caring person from whom they develop a sense of themselves. And the fact that life cannot come from any other combination but male and female union, that the fact that I learn who I am by looking into the eyes of another person, it tells us I cannot learn who I am coming from male, female without experiencing that connection with male and female. And so this same sex as me and opposite sex from me parent become important in the understanding of myself. So did I, okay. And of course, that relates to sexual development. Fathers, as we know, fathers play a really powerful role in protecting children, in that interfacing with the outside world. It's not that mothers are not protective. We all know as a mother, you're very protective, but fathers play a role in the way that the protection happens between the home and the outside world. And it's very significant. It's why children, of course, from non-intact families are more vulnerable. They're more likely to be preyed upon by others. But this shows up very powerfully in sexual development. And this is painful always for my students to hear about, those who experienced divorce when they were younger. And of course, this Ellis's work showed that a father leaving a home earlier, and he was comparing siblings, so looking at the divorce of parents for two daughters. And of course, the divorce might have happened when one daughter was older and one daughter was younger. And then he's looking at what that meant for their outcomes sexually. And what he found was that but a father's presence and emotional closeness. So these two factors are both important, his presence and his closeness to her. Paul Rayburn says, set the reproductive trajectory for girls. That's a pretty strong statement. Father's absence for a long time was the greatest risk factor for teen pregnancy among girls. And then, of course, for boys, and I think what's happening, of course, as you would say, is she's experiencing masculine love in a father that is truly protective and non-sexually interested. And so she's getting an understanding of what real male love that is protective and good feels like. That's a theory, right? Boys, on the other hand, as Popenoe concludes, and others since him, that without fathers, boys develop what he calls a compensatory masculinity, which is that rejecting and denigrating the feminine, proving masculinity through violence and aggression and sexual proclivity. Whereas I love Maggie Gallagher's really powerful statement where she just says, this closeness to dad gives boys an experience of masculinity that is pro-social, pro-woman, pro-child. Should I look at a question now? I'll do the last. I think I just have a couple more slides and then we can do questions. That would be fabulous.
And then also, when you turn that back over to me, I'll be able to help with that too.
That's great. This is my last slide, so I'm going to stop here. And if we need to come back to the slides, we can do that. But I will make you the host. Teresa, that's perfect. And then we can have a conversation about this. Is there anything new that I've shared with you, or anything that comes out as striking now, different from the past?
Oh, that was so awesome. I could have listened forever. It was so good. Marcia has a question. If no one, I'm not seeing any others in the chat, but you should be able to see this as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
In terms of modern culture requiring less and less physical and manual labor,
Yeah.
and what that's doing. Do you have any comment as you read on through that? Could be
Yeah.
the loss of these work world and,
Yeah. Marcia, I love this question because we might have even talked about this a little bit at some point. I can't remember if that little presentation with that UN group, but it is pretty interesting that work has changed so much so that it's brain work and not body work required now for survival, at least in our culture. And I think it has shaped men's sense of being needed, men's sense of being contributors. And I don't know why it is, but I remember when I first, as a research fellow in Washington, D.C. at the Heritage Foundation, Brad Wilcox published his book, Soft Patriarchy, that was all about religious fathers. And it was really debunking the myth that religious fathers were patriarchal in the sense of, a patriarchy, oppressive and hurtful. And it just showed that active religious fathers were actually the closest to their children. They were the most involved. Their wives felt the most appreciated. And I asked him at the time, I said, do you think we would find the same thing by looking at women and religion? And he said, we have looked and it is not there. The effect of religion is not the same in mothers. And so, of course, we could say, well, motherhood is very instinctual and less shaped by structure. But I think at that time, once again, there was so much evidence that men are very impacted by structure. They're impacted by the sense of being needed, by religion impacts their behavior more than it does women, or at least we see more distinction there. We see more distinction in terms of their commitment to children shaped by marriage. They're less committed to their children when they're not married to the mother of those children. And so there's something about, I just think, this need for physical work, the sense of being needed that way, and that less usefulness, less structural, essential, role that's shaped men. Marcia, does that get at any of that?
Yes. And it just strikes me that it's kind of the same thing as if you only went to the grocery store to pick up your food, you've lost contact with what it really takes to produce food, to grow a garden, or to have crops, or to take care of livestock through the whole cycle from where they're a calf to the hamburger on your plate. If you just lost track of that, you just have no sense of it, it would be easy to see, at least for me, I'm thinking it would be easy for them to go, well, sex doesn't matter, gender doesn't matter.
Right. These differences don't matter. Yeah.
Yeah, because they just lost touch with reality almost.
Yep. I think for sure that's played a role. Yeah.
Well, and we'll have generalized in that regard and lumped it all into gender doesn't matter, sex doesn't matter.
Right.
We're all the same. We're just all the same. We all have the same job. We all, there's no need for it anymore, or so they think. But what you've explained, Jenet, is how profound that need and those different roles actually are outside of your workplace.
Yeah. We can't get away from it. I think, is this Tori? I love Tori. So good to have you on. You mentioned the issue of fathers and sexual development can be for students when learning about these findings in class. I do not feel like I have kind of figured out the best way to address these painful realities, like that divorce is associated with this, and people inherently feel marked, like they feel ashamed, and I do not feel like I've quite learned how to do that. I tell them that these are all on average. These are not individuals. This is like sociological broad data. These are predictors of what, more typical kinds of patterns, but we're not talking about individuals. We're talking on average, norm data. But I think also, having said that, and that leaves space for absolute agency in how we, with the help of the Lord, how we overcome the various ways that we are predisposed to some challenges based on our background, and all of us are that way. But I think too, it's just helping them appreciate that these are typical things that when we become aware of, then it helps us to understand ourselves. It's painful, but it helps us understand ourselves and our vulnerabilities and why we process things in a certain way. And when we understand ourselves, then we are better able to address those things and heal them. And that's just real. I had a young man after class when we talked about fathers, and he just said, my dad was incarcerated when I was 3, and I haven't grown up with my dad at all. And he was tearful. He said, I should have had my therapy today instead of yesterday or something. And I said, I am so sorry, Chris, that I didn't prepare you better for this. And he just said, no, it's so important for me to know. It helps me understand myself. And so pain is woven into our mortal experience. Loss is woven into our mortal experience. There's no family that's going to perfectly address the needs of a child, be able to perfectly love. I certainly am not one who can. And so I think appreciating these losses play a very significant role in our development as well. And they are painful, but they're catalysts for growth and understanding. So I'm still figuring out how to address those things. Is there anything
Excellent.
else?
Yes, Alexis has one, and she just says, I hear all the time about the socially constructing between men and women, and I was wondering what you think is actually social construction and what is not, and how to distinguish between those two.
Yeah, that's a great question. I had a student a couple semesters ago. He was in gender studies, and he was just angry at me after something. And he said, you do not understand this topic well. And I thought to myself, there's a lot that I don't understand about development in terms of social construction. So I did a little bit more looking into it. And I think it's very challenging for us to distinguish biological and socially constructed kinds of things. As you can tell from just infant development, then you are shaped by your social experiences. That's how the brain develops. So Mother Nature and Mother Nurture literally combine to create human nature. So just appreciating it is very complex. We know that fathers and mothers actually treat daughters and sons differently. There's a lot of data about that. So mothers are going to talk differently to daughters. They're going to orient them differently. And I think when we're from a frame of mind that all of the differences are what has created the inequality, then we're really afraid of any kind of differences. So it's some way to say we can appreciate there has been inequality. You at the United Nations know how incredibly pervasive the challenges women have faced are, how real they are, how damaging, how, right? There's no question societies have been hard on women. And that means it's hard on men as well. No, right? When we're unequal, it's causing destruction to both. And so I think we can say, undoubtedly, social construction has played a role in painful things, in inequality, in oppression of women, in all of those things. But then to say what people want in the end is wholeness in relationships. That does not come from a denial of biological differences, but from an appreciation of those differences that then bring us together in equal, right? In partnership, in oneness, real oneness. I'm not answering that perfectly. I think when we look at the brain, we can see there are obvious structural differences. Those are real. When we look at physiologically, hormones we experience, the fact that a mother bears life, she is going to be different because of her biological experiences. But I also tell students the socially constructed differences that are emphasized don't just emerge out of nowhere. There is a material biological root. Now, do they end up distorted sometimes? For sure. But just appreciation, they don't just, right? The fact that we can have women with a sense of neediness and men with oppressive, like that unhealthy, that immature masculine feminine dynamic, that there's a biological root to that probably, and it's just acting itself out in distorted ways in the culture, and the culture is perpetuating it. So we do talk about social construction and the distortions around gender differences, and that we can hold on to differences and create equality. You can't have equality without differences, really. Sorry, that was rambling. So.
No, that was awesome. Just another comment about great presentation. It seems like so many TV commercials and TV series represent men as imbeciles. As a man, this data made me feel way more important as a father. And I loved the different subtleties of mother and father. Spot on. That was from Brad. So
You're super important, Brad.
Yeah.
We all know that. And I, yeah, I love that. In fact, you and Wendy kind of embody this for me. You don't have to look prototypical male or prototypical female in whatever our weird notions of those can be. But just the distinction between you, that manhood, that womanhood is just such a powerful influence on children. And whenever I present this, I feel like at the end I've talked more about dads than moms because I think we've needed data to confirm what dads do. And it's really powerful and really real. So.
Yeah. Any other comments, questions, anything else, Jenet, from your standpoint that would be an add-in to anything that has come to mind in wrapping up the discussion?
I keep wondering, I'd love to have insights on how this looks multiculturally. I think there's still question about these differences. How do they show up in different cultures? And you have experience with that. I have no doubt that they are consistent differences. I don't know if they look somewhat different in terms of behaviors or based on culture, but that is something I'm excited to learn more about, how they show up in Africa and how they show up in Asia, and how but that embodiment of manhood and womanhood is just going to be real.
And it would go back to the combination biological as well as social. So
yeah, I think that's right, Teresa.
Yeah. Oh, well, Wendy says amazing presentation, Jenet. Thank you.
Thank you all. You are so gracious to listen. Like heroes that know far more than I do the truth. Thank you, Carol, for graciously, Camille, Wendy, Tori. Poor Tori's heard this so many times. I think she'll be like, I can give the presentation.
Oh, it was great. And it's fun coming from you as well with all of your experience and research. And so thank you so much.